I was 21, fresh out of college with a degree that hadn't quite paid off yet, so I was doing what most young adults in my situation do. I was piecing together an income through odd jobs. Babysitting was the most reliable source. That's how I ended up with the Masons, a seemingly perfect, sweet family with 2 little girls, 6-year-old Lily and 4-year-old Emma. They lived in an immaculate, newly built home in one of those suburban developments where every lawn is manicured and every porch looks like a magazine spread. The Mason house was a palace of light and modernity. It was all huge, open-concept living spaces, high ceilings, and walls of glass. The first thing that drew your eye was the massive kitchen island, a gleaming, smooth slab of white quartz that sat directly across from the living room couch. The entire area, from the kitchen to the living room, was bathed in light from the wall of sliding glass doors overlooking their pristine backyard, which backed up to a heavily wooded nature preserve. The Masons were easy to work for. Their routine was clockwork. Dinner, bath, stories, and the girls were asleep by 9:30 p.m., leaving me with hours of quiet, well-paid downtime. It was, I thought, the easiest gig I'd ever had. I settled into the plush couch that night, around 10:45 p.m., the house settling around me. It was too quiet, perhaps, but that's what made it perfect. The only light on downstairs was a small table lamp near the sofa, and the soft glow spilling in from the backyard security light. I was slumped down, half scrolling through my phone, half watching a rerun on the huge flat-screen TV. The house felt cavernous and still. It was precisely 11:03 p.m. when I looked up. It wasn't a sudden movement or a sound that caught my attention. It was just a natural, lazy glance toward the kitchen. And that's when I saw it. Across the smooth, white surface of the island, a shadow was cast. Not a faint, wavering shadow from a tree branch or a car headlight, but a tall, perfectly defined human silhouette. It was standing just on the other side of the island, where the built-in shelving and stools were. It was utterly still. I slowly brought my phone down, my thumb hovering over the keypad. My breath hitched in my throat. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Was it my own shadow? No. The light was behind me, and this shadow was too tall, too defined, and positioned exactly as if a person were standing upright, facing me, on the opposite side of the counter. The kitchen was massive. There was no light source that could cast a shadow like that, so sharp and motionless from that location. I squeezed my eyes shut, counted to 3, and opened them again. The silhouette was still there, a block of dark against the pale quartz. It didn't waver, didn't shift. It was just standing there. I slowly reached for my phone, my hand trembling now, ready to call 911. My fingers brushed the smooth glass of the screen, and in that exact second, as my hand moved, the shadow didn't flicker or run. It simply vanished. One moment, the tall, perfectly defined shape was there. The next, the smooth white countertop was empty. It was as if someone had just switched off a projector aimed at the wall, but there was no projector and no wall. There was just nothing. I sat there for 5 minutes, heart pounding against my ribs, convinced I was hallucinating from exhaustion. I stood up, walked into the kitchen, and flipped on the overhead lights. The space was bright, sterile, and perfectly empty. I rationalized it. A trick of the eye, light adjusting, maybe a smudge on the glass door that briefly caught the light just right. But the knot of dread in my stomach told me otherwise. 10 minutes later, I decided I needed to move, to do something normal to break the silent tension of the house. I went upstairs to check on the girls. Their large bedroom was at the end of the hall, a room they shared with matching twin beds and a ridiculous amount of stuffed animals. I opened the door softly, careful not to creak the hinges, and paused to let my eyes adjust. They had a small nightlight glowing near the dresser, and immediately, I saw it again. It wasn't a shadow this time. It was something worse. It was a dense, absolute lack of light. A solid black void that looked like someone had cut a silhouette, not out of paper, but out of the very air in the room. It was positioned directly in the corner between the dresser and the large built-in closet. It was the exact same size and shape as the silhouette I had seen in the kitchen, tall, human-shaped, and perfectly still. Unlike a shadow, which fades or diffuses, this was a block of darkness that defied the room's soft nightlight. It was just present, an absence of visual information, an impossible static hole in the illuminated room. My breath stalled in my chest. I couldn't scream. I couldn't even move my feet. I just stood rooted to the carpet, breathing fast and shallow, trying to logically place the source. A piece of clothing hung on the door? No, the closet door was fully shut. A trick of the window light? No, the blinds were closed tight, and the light source was inside the room. This thing was a block of darkness, a perfect, absolute silhouette. The logical part of my brain finally kicked in, screaming at me to find a cause. I forced myself to move, walking slowly, deliberately, across the room. My heart hammered so hard I thought the sound would wake the girls. As I approached the corner, the cold dread intensified. I reached out a shaking hand, and, with a metallic click that sounded deafeningly loud in the silence, flicked on the main overhead light. The light flooded the room, the brightness immediate and absolute. The black silhouette vanished instantly, swallowed whole by the light. The corner was empty. Just the pale blue wall, a basket of toys, and the closed closet door. I stood there, blinking in the sudden harsh light, my body shaking with adrenaline. I heard a small movement. Lily, the 6-year-old, sat up groggily in her bed, rubbing her eyes. "Did you see it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I turned quickly, trying to sound calm and steady, but the word came out shaky. "See what, honey?" Lily yawned, looking past me toward the now bright corner. "The shadow man," she mumbled, pulling the covers up to her chin. He was just standing there looking at my dolls again. The air went out of my lungs. He looks at your dolls?" I managed, trying to keep my voice flat, conversational. She nodded sleepily. "Yeah. Sometimes he moves them, but mostly he just stands. Mommy and Daddy say he goes away if you turn the big light on." "Did he go away?" "Yes, honey. He went away," I said, my voice feeling strangely detached from my body. I walked over to her bed and tucked her back in, forcing myself to smile. "Go back to sleep, okay? It's just a dream." But she shook her head slowly. "Not a dream. He was in the kitchen earlier, on the island." My stomach dropped like a stone. She saw it too. She knew where I had been. "Lily," I leaned in, trying to make my voice soft and urgent. "Did you tell Mommy and Daddy about the shadow man?" She hummed. "They said it's just the house settling, but they said when the lights go out, I need to stay very still, and don't talk to him." She then rolled over, satisfied, and was already drifting back to sleep. I stood there in the bright room, feeling my reality shift violently. The horror wasn't that the house was haunted. It was that this entity, this silent, observing silhouette, was known. It was normal to this family. I realized with a chilling certainty that the parents didn't need a sitter for the kids. They needed one for the shadow, someone new and temporary to draw its silent, malevolent attention away from their family for the night. A decoy. I moved quickly, my mind in a state of controlled panic. I pulled the heavy dresser across the room until it was wedged against the door. Then, I turned the main light off and flipped the small nightlight back on. The corner was now visible but empty. I grabbed a small plastic rocking horse and wedged it under the door handle for good measure. Then I quietly slipped out, locking the door behind me and placing the key on the narrow hallway ledge. right beside a ceramic photo frame of the girls. I didn't want to go downstairs. The living room, with its wall of glass and the smooth, reflective island, felt like a trap. I chose the brightest, smallest room I could find, the upstairs linen closet, which also housed a small laundry chute and had a fluorescent light. I pulled out my phone and tried to call my sister, but she didn't pick up. I couldn't call the police. What would I say? A shadow man that only appears in the dark is staring at my dolls, and a 6-year-old confirmed it? They'd send a psychiatric evaluation team, not a patrol car. I had to figure out what was happening, or at least get out without creating a panic. The Masons were due back around 1 a.m. I checked the clock. 11:47 p.m., an hour and 13 minutes. As I sat there, knees pulled to my chest, pressed against the folded towels, I kept staring at the small gap beneath the linen closet door. It was well lit by the fluorescent bulb. Then, I heard a sound from the hallway, outside the closet, a quiet, scraping sound. It wasn't the sound of floorboards creaking, but a gentle, almost silky friction, like something heavy and smooth being dragged over a wood surface. I held my breath, listening. The sound stopped directly outside the closet door. The small gap beneath the door remained brightly lit by my light, but slowly, a change began to happen in the light filtering through. A sliver of the light began to turn black. It wasn't a shadow being cast over the light. It was the light itself being blocked. The blackness seeped in, dense and absolute, taking the shape of a vertical line. It was the thickness of an adult human foot, standing perpendicular to the door. It was the shadow man, standing silently, observing my hiding place. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stared at the sliver of absolute blackness beneath the door. It stood there for what felt like an eternity, that silent, impossible void of light. Then, as slowly as it appeared, it retracted, and the gap beneath the door was bright again. The scraping sound, the sound of its movement, receded down the hallway and stopped right outside the girl's bedroom door. I could hear the faint, muffled sound of the plastic rocking horse being pushed against the wood. It was trying to get in. I stayed in that closet, frozen for 45 minutes, until my phone chimed. It was a text from Mrs. Mason. "Just pulling into the driveway. Thanks again, be there in a sec." I scrambled out of the closet and ran down the stairs. The house was exactly as I had left it. I went to the front door just as I heard the car engine cut off outside. Mr. and Mrs. Mason walked in, smiling and relaxed. "Oh, honey, you're still up. Thanks so much," Mrs. Mason chirped, handing me a wad of cash. "The girls are asleep, the room is locked, and the key is on the ledge," I stated, my voice flat, my eyes scanning the kitchen island and the corners of the room. Mr. Mason frowned slightly. "Locked? Why did you lock the door?" "Lily said something about a shadow man," I replied, unable to stop myself. I met his eyes, and I saw it. Not panic, not confusion, but a quick, knowing flicker of resigned weariness. Mrs. Mason quickly stepped forward, putting a hand on my arm. "Oh, you know Lily. She has the wildest imagination. We've had a few contractor issues, some funny light reflections since the build. Please don't worry about it." I pulled my arm back gently. She said he was looking at her dolls, and she said he was in the kitchen on the island. I saw him too. Mr. Mason sighed, putting his keys on the table. "Look, we appreciate you watching the house. Here's a little extra for your troubles." He handed me another 20. "Just a weird house, all right? It's new, but sometimes you get things." He wouldn't meet my gaze. "We're having a different girl start on Wednesday. No need for you to come back next weekend." I realized then that they weren't sending me home. They were firing me because I hadn't been a good decoy. I was too observant, too sensitive to the thing. I was meant to have been so focused on my phone that I wouldn't have noticed the presence, just enough of a live, warm body to occupy it for the night. I didn't argue. I just grabbed my purse, nodded once, and walked out the door. As I backed my car out of their perfect, immaculate driveway, I glanced one last time at the house. The bedroom light was off, and in the sheer blackness of the front window, I saw the perfect tall silhouette standing there, still and silent, looking out into the night. But it wasn't standing alone anymore. It was standing directly between the two parents, one on either side, all three silhouetted in the darkness, waiting for the morning light to hide it again. Be wary of the perfect facade. When a situation, a person, or a place appears unnaturally immaculate or easy, it is often hiding a fundamental, dangerous flaw that someone else is desperately trying to conceal or offload. Sometimes you aren't being hired for a job. You are being hired as a shield. My name is Jasmine, but everyone in the neighborhood called me Miss J. At 15, house sitting for extra cash felt like a pretty good gig, especially on a Tuesday afternoon in July. The sun was pouring over the Halversons' manicured lawn, the scent of freshly cut grass hanging heavy in the air, and down the street, I could hear the rhythmic thwack of a tennis ball. The atmosphere was disarming, aggressively normal. I was watching 8-year-old twins, Max and Sam. Their mom, Mrs. Halverson, had called me around noon, apologizing profusely. "Jay, I am so sorry, but I have a last-minute emergency meeting with the school board. It's unavoidable. Can you cover until 7? I agreed immediately. More hours meant more money toward the used car I desperately wanted. She seemed rushed, maybe a little stressed, but nothing out of the ordinary. She gave the boys a quick hug, told me the pizza was already paid for, and sped off in her SUV. The boys and I were sprawled out in the family room, building some ridiculously complex Lego spaceship. Max was arguing with Sam about the placement of a fin when I heard it. A soft, metallic shhh. It was the sound of the sliding patio door opening, followed by a quiet thud as it slid shut. "Did you guys invite anyone over?" I whispered, putting down my piece of Lego. Max shook his head, his eyes wide. Mom said no one was allowed. The Halversons were very strict about that. I told the boys to stay put and silent. I crept toward the hallway leading to the kitchen, my heart starting to pound not from fear of a ghost or a slasher, but from the sudden, jarring intrusion into our quiet afternoon. I figured it was a neighborhood kid, or maybe a thief. I peered around the corner of the banister, looking down into the kitchen. It wasn't a stranger. It was Mr. Lyle Halverson. Lyle Halverson was an imposing man, usually quiet and polite, a retired professor who always wore a blazer. But the man in the kitchen now was different. He was standing perfectly still, his back to me, and he was covered in blood. It was dried, rusty brown blood spatter on his shirt and across the back of his neck, but it wasn't gushing. He looked utterly calm, methodical, as though he were performing a tedious household chore. He wasn't rushing, wasn't looking for valuables, and wasn't making a sound. He simply walked to the kitchen window and slowly, deliberately, pulled the blind down. Swoosh. Then he moved to the deadbolt on the garage door, flipped the lock, and engaged the top security chain. Click. Clack. I pulled back from the banister, retreating silently until my back hit the wall. The true horror of the situation hit me. The emergency meeting was a lie. Something had happened, something violent given the blood, and Lyle was home, but he wasn't well. He was locking us in. I crept back to the family room. Max and Sam were still whispering, confused. "Boys," I mouthed, "we have to be absolutely silent." I picked up the landline phone. Dead air. He must have cut the lines before coming inside, or maybe I was just praying that the storm had knocked out service. I checked my cell phone. No signal. The neighborhood's security bubble had burst. We were trapped in a silent house with a man who knew every hiding spot and every creak. He believed he was saving his family from the outside world, and I was just an obstacle, or maybe tragically, part of the family he intended to save. Lyle had disappeared from the kitchen, and the entire house had fallen into an unnatural silence. We had retreated to the master bedroom upstairs, the one room with a door that had a small, old-fashioned bolt lock. It wouldn't hold him for long, but it gave us a moment. The boys were crying silently, and I held them close, trying to project a calm I didn't feel. "We have to get out," I whispered. "The windows. Can we open the windows?" The window was old, heavy, and painted shut. It took all my strength to shove it up just enough to create a gap. The cool breeze on my face was a jolt of reality. We were on the second floor. It was a rough drop, but not impossible if we could break the fall. The problem was getting to the window without being heard. Lyle knew this house intimately. I pictured him downstairs, the hammer I had briefly glimpsed tucked into his waistband, waiting patiently. I knew that the second-to-last step on the main staircase always squeaked, and the third floorboard outside the master bath always groaned. I moved first, pulling Sam after me. "Step lightly. Exactly where I step," I instructed. We navigated the obstacle course of the upstairs hall in slow motion. Creak. We froze. It wasn't the floorboard. It was the sound of a door opening downstairs, followed by a heavy padded thud from the landing. Lyle was now on the staircase. I pushed Sam and Max into the laundry room, which had a small window overlooking the roof of the garage. "Hide in here, under the linen basket. Don't make a sound no matter what you hear." I moved back toward the master bedroom, trying to draw him away from the boys. I stepped onto the infamous third floorboard. It gave a loud, agonizing groan. Too late. The floorboard had worked. It had bought me a moment. The methodical footsteps in the hall paused, then rerouted toward the master bedroom. I sprinted back into the room, slammed the door shut, and slid the bolt home. I didn't hide. I went straight for the window. I needed a distraction, something to make him believe I was still in the room. I snatched a heavy antique lamp off the nightstand and hurled it against the far wall. Crash! Almost immediately, the sound was followed by a heavy shoulder hitting the door. Bam! The old wooden frame groaned, and the bolt threatened to give. Bam! Again. The wood around the bolt cracked. I didn't have time to hesitate. I wrenched the window open wider, shoved the thick area rug underneath the sill to soften the edge, and looked out. The drop was 15 feet to a flower bed, but just beside the window was a thick, robust rose trellis climbing up the wall. I raced to the laundry room, pulling Sam and Max out. "Quickly! Out the window! The trellis is right there!" Max, being the braver twin, went first. I lowered him out, supporting his weight until his sneakers found purchase on the crossbars of the trellis. "Go down fast. Keep going until your feet touch grass. Don't look back." Sam was next. He was crying and scared, but the sheer terror of the repeated BAM! From the master bedroom was a powerful motivator. I lowered him too, watching until he was halfway down. I could hear the master bedroom door splintering behind me. I looked back. The door was buckling. Sam was almost at the bottom. Max was already running toward the neighbor's yard. Safety. They were safe. I had to go. I climbed onto the windowsill, my legs already dangling outside, searching for the trellis. I could hear the final, desperate cracking sound of the door frame giving way. I was halfway out when a piece of the door exploded inward, and I heard the heavy thud of the door hitting the wall. I froze, heart hammering. I hadn't looked back, but I knew he was there. I heard his breath, not frantic but slow and deep, right behind me. He wasn't rushing. He didn't need to. I was framed perfectly in the window, my back to him, one leg still inside the room. "Leaving so soon, Miss J?" His voice was a calm, low whisper, entirely devoid of anger or panic, which made it the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. I felt the sudden, chilling pressure of his finger on the back of my shoulder, the lightest touch imaginable. I turned my head just enough to see him. He was standing in the doorway, the shattered wood frame framing his figure. The hammer was now held loosely at his side, dripping slightly. His eyes were wide and focused, completely lost in his own reality. He had an expression of serene disappointment, like a father catching a child trying to sneak out after curfew. He raised his bloody hand to his own lips. His eyes held mine, conveying a warning that needed no words. He simply said, "Shh." The screen cut to black. I was 18, eager for independence and any job that got me out of the local mall. That's how I ended up accepting the most unusual babysitting gig of my life. It was for the Jensens, a family that owned a remote, wood-paneled cabin they used as a weekend retreat. It wasn't a cozy vacation spot. It was rustic, dark, and felt ancient, situated right on the edge of a deep, endless forest. The nearest neighbor was a mile away. The kids were great. 10-year-old Mike, who was obsessed with comic books, 8-year-old Chloe, who was perpetually drawing, and the little guy, 4-year-old Sam, who was a miniature, quiet observer of the world. The cabin itself was unnerving. The wood paneling seemed to absorb all the light, and every window looked directly into heavy, overgrown foliage. The backyard was just a small, weathered wooden deck that ended abruptly, giving way to thick, unkempt woods and a neglected garden patch that seemed to thrive on shadow. Mrs. Jensen, a nervous woman with permanently tired eyes, had only one specific repeated rule. Never let the kids go into the garden after dark. There are too many loose stones, and it's very easy to get lost in the undergrowth out there. She made it sound like a mild safety warning, but her tone was sharp, almost frantic. I nodded, agreeing that keeping the kids on the brightly lit deck was common sense anyway. That night, as a thick, cold rain began to hammer the roof, I started the bedtime ritual, which involved a long, completely improvised story requested by Sam. I was about to find out exactly why they feared the garden after dark. The 3 kids were tucked into the largest bedroom, which faced the ominous backyard. The window was tall and old, the glass streaked with the heavy downpour, making the world outside look blurry and fractured. I was sitting on the edge of Mike's bed, my hands flying, weaving a dramatic, rambling tale about a lost pirate ship named the Silent Wanderer. I was using my full range of voices and sound effects, enjoying the rapt attention of my audience. As I was describing the pirate captain's great brass telescope, I looked up at the window. My focus, which had been entirely on my storytelling, immediately shifted, arrested by something in the pitch-black garden, deep past the deck's edge. The storm had made the woods outside an absolute inky void, save for the faint reflection of the room light on the wet glass. But in that void, low to the ground, partially hidden by the wet, thrashing shrubs, were 2 perfect neon green lights. They weren't the scattered, pulsing lights of fireflies, and they certainly weren't reflections, because they were focused, constant, and internal. They were 2 glowing, unblinking spheres, set exactly the distance apart where eyes would be on a creature of substantial size. They were watching the window, watching me. A cold wave of paralyzing fear washed over me. I kept the story going, forcing the words out, my voice thin and tight. "And the captain saw the whale," I stammered, my hand gestures becoming jerky and unnatural. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Could it be a pair of reflective stakes? No, the light was too organic, too intense, and far too high off the ground for garden markers. Fireflies? They blink, and this light was constant, focused, and unmoving. It was like 2 charged spheres suspended in the absolute blackness. The children, thankfully, seemed mesmerized by my shaking hands and strained voice, not yet noticing my gaze was locked on the window. I pushed the story forward, trying to reach a natural conclusion so I could get up and close the heavy curtains, or better yet, lock the door and call the parents. But my tongue felt thick and heavy in my mouth. I couldn't look away from the 2 cold, luminous points staring directly into the room. I reached the climax of my story. The pirate captain, having found his lost treasure, was about to sail home. My voice was trembling uncontrollably now, pitched too high. As I struggled to finish the sentence, and he gave a mighty cheer, the green lights shifted. They began to rise, slowly, They didn't move forward toward the house, nor did they sway with the wind and rain. They just floated straight upward, keeping their perfect distance, a smooth, deliberate vertical ascent. It indicated that the creature, whatever it was slowly, laboriously, standing up from a low, crouching position. The implication of its size was instantaneous and terrifying. It had been low to the ground when it was initially hidden by the shrubs. Now, as it rose, it began to clear the surrounding foliage. My voice cracked mid-word. I stopped the story mid-sentence, the word cheer dying in my throat. I couldn't move. I was locked in a state of terror, watching the impossible spectacle outside the glass. The silence in the room, following my dramatic monologue, was deafening. The only sound was the incessant drumming of the rain on the window pane. Mike and Chloe, sensing the abrupt halt in my narrative and the paralyzing tension in my body, stopped their fidgeting. They looked at me, then, naturally, followed my rigid gaze to the window. 4-year-old Sam, the smallest and quietest of the three, looked up and saw it too. He didn't scream or cry. He just tilted his head, his face a perfect picture of quiet curiosity and familiarity. "What is it?" he asked, his voice a tiny, innocent squeak that cut through the silence. The glowing green eyes were now slightly above the level of the window ledge. They were huge, taking up far too much of the dark space. In the brief, reflected light of the bedroom, I could vaguely make out a shape surrounding the eyes, something dark and uneven, like wet moss or rough, dark hide, and they were still, completely, terrifyingly still. They weren't looking at me anymore. They were looking into the room, scanning the space. My mind was screaming, "Move, grab them, pull the blinds." But I was paralyzed, caught between the instinct to protect the children and the absolute, petrifying terror of provoking the thing that was now level with my gaze. I was about to make a desperate lunge for the curtain cord when Sam did the most terrifying thing. He whispered. He didn't whisper to me, asking for an explanation or comfort. He whispered to the window. "You're not supposed to stare, Mr. Moss. It makes the story stop." The shock of hearing the creature, the entity, the shadow with the neon eyes, called by name, completely broke my paralysis. I stared at Sam, my eyes wide with a confusion that transcended fear. Mr. Moss. He knew it. He addressed it. And then, the impossible happened again. The lights blinked. It was one single, slow, deliberate blink. The green spheres vanished for a fraction of a second, and then reappeared, just as bright, just as constant. The act of blinking was a terrifying confirmation that this thing was biological, conscious, and had registered Sam's quiet complaint. Sam then looked at me, a tiny frown on his face. "Now finish the story," he murmured, settling back into his pillow, as if scolding the monster outside was a routine, everyday occurrence, and now that the interruption was dealt with, we could return to normal. I managed to breathe. "Sam, what is Mr. Moss?" My voice was barely a rasp. "He just watches us," Sam replied simply, "since we moved here. He likes to listen to the stories, but he can't stand up like that until the story is finished. Mommy says he's shy." I looked from Sam to the window. The green eyes were still there, unblinking again, seemingly waiting for my next move. The parents' rule about the garden suddenly clicked into place. It wasn't about loose stones or getting lost. It was about allowing the children to get too close to the creature they called Mr. Moss. And my role? I wasn't just a sitter. I was the entertainer, the distraction, the central figure in the nightly ritual that this thing came to observe. My fear twisted into cold, rational adrenaline. The creature knew the rules of the house, knew its name, and responded to verbal commands from a child. This wasn't a bear or a reflection. It was something tied to this place, to this family, and to this specific ritual. I forced a sickly smile at the kids. "The story has to pause now, Pirate Code," I said, trying to mimic my earlier dramatic tone. "We have to play a game now. A very quiet game." I grabbed Mike and Chloe, who were now silently watching me, their confusion overriding their fear. I hauled them out of bed, scooped up the surprisingly heavy Sam, and rushed them across the hall to the smaller, windowless guest bathroom. I didn't turn on the light. I shoved all three of them into the room and locked the door with a loud final click. "Stay in here. Do not open the door until I tell you to," I ordered, my voice firm and low. I then ran back to the main bedroom. I didn't dare turn on the light. In the dim reflection on the window, I saw the green eyes. They were still there, still watching the now empty beds. The silence felt aggressive. I snatched my purse, pulled out my phone, and backed slowly out of the room, keeping my eyes on the window until I reached the doorframe. I didn't dare go downstairs to the landline. I needed to be able to move fast. I raced into the dimly lit hallway, my heart threatening to beat out of my chest, and quickly punched in Mrs. Jensen's number. It rang only once before she answered, her voice sounding immediately alert and slightly panicked. "Hello? What's wrong?" "Mrs. Jensen, I need you to come home now," I whispered, pressing myself against the wall, listening for any sign of movement from the bedroom. I was 17 that summer, facing down a tuition bill that felt heavier than my whole life. I needed money fast, the kind of cash that didn't come from scooping ice cream. That's how I ended up answering an ad for a part-time babysitter for the Rourke family, 2 blocks from my high school. My name is Sarah, and what followed was the most genuinely unsettling experience of my life. A slow burn realization that still makes me check my deadbolts. The mom, Elena Rourke, was sweet and scatterbrained, a busy doctor who handled the scheduling. But the person who gave me the job, and the person I had to report to, was the father, Mr. Rourke. He was a retired history professor, thin and severe, with a reputation in the neighborhood for being eccentric. He was in his late 50s, always wearing a perfectly crisp starched shirt, and he moved with an almost unnatural precision. The first time I met him, his handshake was dry and firm, and his eyes, a watery blue, took me in from my worn Converse to the nervous knot in my hair. The twins, an 8-year-old boy and girl named Leo and Lila, were easy kids. The jobs were simple. Feed them dinner, help with homework, and put them to bed by 9. I usually spent the next 3 hours reading on their ridiculously large leather couch while waiting for the Rourkes to return from their symphony dates or gallery openings. The pay was fantastic, easily covering my spring semester books. But Mr. Rourke was immediately strange. Every time he spoke to me, his gaze was slow, deliberate. It felt less like a conversation and more like an assessment. He wouldn't just glance at me. He'd scan my features, my hands, even the way I sat. The first few times, I dismissed it as a professor's habit, trained to observe, to critique. Then the name started. It was the first, most confusing clue that something was deeply wrong. Every time he was ready to leave, he'd stop at the front door, turn, and fix me with that intense gaze. "Now, remember, Megan," he'd say, stressing the name sharply. "No guests, and the emergency number is on the fridge." "It's Sarah, sir," I'd correct him, forcing a polite smile. He'd chuckle, a dry, papery sound. Right. Forgive me, Jennifer. Head full of old history, I suppose." I corrected him 3 times that first week. It seemed like a genuine, if rude, habit of a distracted academic. But as the weeks went on, the names got stranger, older, and more dated. Doris, Marlene, Betty, names that sounded like they belonged to women his age, not a girl struggling to pay for college. It was annoying, unprofessional, and profoundly unsettling. I started looking forward to the nights Elena Rourke dropped me off and picked me up, just to avoid the bizarre, slow-motion insult of his misidentification. I was 3 weeks into the job when the real shift happened. It was a Saturday night, and the twins were asleep upstairs. Mr. Rourke had announced he was going for a quick errand to pick up a special cigar from his club downtown. He made his usual exit, stopping at the door, turning, and hitting me with a new name. "Be vigilant, Susan," he'd instructed with a small, unsettling smirk. Then the front door closed, and I heard the unmistakable sound of his Mercedes engine starting up and pulling away from the curb. The entire house settled into silence. I remember thinking about the name Susan. It was slightly closer to my generation than Doris, but still felt wrong. I tried to shake off the weirdness and went back to reading a novel on the couch. 10 minutes later, the air conditioning kicked off, and in the sudden silence, I heard it. The subtle but distinct scrape of a key in the front door lock, followed by the soft click of the door closing again. I sat straight up, my heart immediately thumping against my ribs. He forgot something, I thought, standing up. But instead of walking into the living room, which was the main room off the foyer, I heard a different sound, the clack-clack of his leather-soled dress shoes on the tiled floor of the kitchen, which was located at the far end of the house beyond the main hall. "Mr. Rourke?" I called out hesitantly. I didn't like the silence that followed. I didn't like the darkness of the hall. "Don't worry, Susan." His voice drifted out of the inky blackness of the kitchen. It sounded muffled, closer than before, but still casual. "Just getting a glass of water. Didn't realize I was so thirsty." I hesitated. He knew the routine was to check in. He was supposed to walk past the living room and say hello. Why stand in the dark kitchen? Why didn't he turn on the light? The whole thing felt wrong. The house felt too big, too dark, and suddenly the silence was aggressive. I sat back down, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just another weird Rourke quirk. But my eyes kept darting toward the kitchen door, and the hair on my arms was standing on end. I waited, listening for the sound of running water or the refrigerator door opening. I heard nothing, just the silence. Then about 5 minutes later, I heard it again. A tiny, almost inaudible click of the deadbolt being unlocked from the inside, followed by the soft, controlled snick of the front door opening and then closing, even quieter than the first time. This time, when the front door closed, a sudden sweep of bright, powerful headlights cut across the living room window. I watched his silver sedan pull out of the driveway again, the same car I had watched leave 10 minutes earlier. He hadn't gotten a glass of water. He had been in the house, silent, in the dark, for the better part of 15 minutes, hiding from me, listening. He had performed the second exit. I was terrified. The next time he hired me, I wanted to quit, but the check for that shift was the one that would cover my remaining book fees. I rationalized it. I just had to get through one more night. I told myself I'd watch TV in the twins' room and lock the door, but I knew that was overkill, and a breach of trust. That night, the exit was different. He used the name Marlene, and his gaze lingered for a moment longer than usual. The sound of his car pulling away was louder, more definite, as if he knew I was listening. I waited until the house was completely silent, the twins long asleep. I didn't sit down. I walked immediately to the kitchen and looked at the tile floor. Nothing was out of place. He was too careful. He hadn't needed a glass of water. He had been there to observe. My mind was reeling from the violation. I needed proof, something concrete to explain the terror that was now a cold lump in my stomach. I knew where to look. Mr. Rourke had a large study off the main hall, a room full of antique maps and heavy wooden furniture. He kept it locked, but the last time I'd cleaned up, I saw him slide the spare key into the ceramic pineapple dish on his desk. I crept down the hall, my heart beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. The pineapple dish was right where I remembered. The key was a small, ornate skeleton key. It was almost too easy to unlock the study door and slip inside, flicking on the small, dim desk lamp. The room smelled like old paper and pipe tobacco. I immediately went to his enormous oak desk, pulling open drawers. In the bottom left drawer, beneath a stack of old lecture notes, I found them. A stack of worn, spiral-bound notebooks. They were cheap, the kind you buy during back-to-school sales. Each one was carefully labeled on the cover in his precise, neat script. Babysitter logs, 2018 to 2019. Babysitter logs, 2020 to 2021. And so on, going back almost 15 years. I pulled one labeled 2023, to 2024 and flipped it open. It wasn't about the kids. The pages were organized in columns. Date, hours, name used, mood description, time of entry, second pass. I ran my finger down the columns, my breath catching in my throat. Every date I had worked was listed, and next to each date was a name: Doris, Betty, Megan, Jennifer, and that last terrifying entry, Susan. And next to that name, a new column: mood/description, quiet, reading, almost too still. Then the final chilling column, time of entry -second pass. And next to every single one of my shifts, 10:15 p.m., 10:20 p.m., 10:18 p.m. Always a precise entry, 10 to 15 minutes after the initial car exit. The horror hit me with the physical force of a punch to the gut. The names he used weren't random slips of the tongue. They were a catalog. He wasn't misremembering my name. He was calling me by the names of the previous sitters he had briefly stalked in their own house. I quickly flipped to the older logs, running my finger down the list of names. Connie, Shirley, Veronica, dozens of them, all young women who had worked for him, all meticulously documented. The name used column in the current log, my log, was the key. He would leave, sneak back in, hide in the dark, usually the kitchen or the laundry room, and observe the current girl in her solitude. He would listen to her read, watch her glance up at the door, hear her breathing. Then, based on the way she handled her loneliness or her fear, he would assign her the name of a former sitter whom she most resembled in that vulnerable private moment. He was collecting their reactions, cataloging their solitude, linking one girl's experience of fear to another's. I was simultaneously Sarah, the girl who needed tuition money, and Susan, the sitter who was quiet and read too still. I was Betty, the girl who checked the locks nervously, and Marlene, the girl who jumped at the sound of the old house settling. He wasn't interested in me as a person. I was just a vessel for a specific, cultivated sensation of creeping terror. He was marking his log, checking off a collection of fear he had secretly amassed over 15 years. My eyes landed on the oldest log, 2010 to 2011. I saw an entry. Name used, Megan. Mood/description, hysterical, called police. The time of entry second pass was listed as aborted. My stomach twisted. Someone else had discovered him. Someone else had called him on it. But most of the other logs had neat, clean entries. Most of the other girls had been too polite, too anxious about being hysterical, or too desperate for the money, just like I was, to confront him. They had simply been observed, cataloged, and replaced. I quickly snapped the notebook shut, slid it back under the stack of lecture notes, and locked the study door, replacing the key in the pineapple dish. The silence of the house was now unbearable. It was no longer a sign of peace. It was the sound of a predator waiting. I felt the overwhelming need to check the dark kitchen, the laundry room, the hall closet, but I was too terrified to move. I forced myself to walk back to the couch and pretend to read, the book shaking in my hands, waiting for the sound of his car to announce his true return. When Mr. Rourke finally pulled back into the driveway, it felt like an eternity had passed. I was standing by the door, already wearing my jacket and holding my bag before the engine was even fully shut off. I wanted out. Now. He walked in, looking exactly as he had when he left. Immaculate shirt, precise movements. He looked tired, but satisfied, like a scholar who had just completed a difficult but rewarding piece of research. "Ah, Sarah," he said, and for the first time he used my actual name. The change was chilling. It felt like a deliberate acknowledgement of the game being over. "Everything quiet?" "Yes, sir. The kids were fine. They're asleep," I said, my voice thin but level. I was determined not to betray the panic churning inside me. I needed to get my pay and leave cleanly. He walked to the hall table and picked up his checkbook, opening it slowly. His back was to me. "You know, you're a remarkably placid girl, Sarah," he mused without turning around. Quite different from, say, Jennifer. She was flighty. Or poor Betty, who was constantly rearranging the cushions. You have the stillness of Susan. He wrote out the check, his pen scratching against the paper, a sound that seemed deafening in the silence. He turned, handing me the check with that same dry, firm handshake. His watery blue eyes held mine, and I saw a flicker of something in them. Not malice, but the intellectual satisfaction of a collector. "I appreciate your candor, sir," I managed, clutching the check. "I won't be able to sit for you again. My class schedule changed. I won't be available." His smile didn't reach his eyes. It was a slight upturn of his lips, a look of perfect understanding. "A shame," he said simply. "I'll miss your presence, Sarah." He used my name again, but this time it felt like a threat, an indication that my real name was now also filed away in his catalog, associated with the final moment of discovery. I walked out the door and never looked back. I tore up the tuition check the moment I got to my car, tossing the pieces into the back seat. The money wasn't worth the feeling of being watched, cataloged, and named by a stranger who collected fear-like stamps. I found another job washing dishes. It paid less, but every night when I came home, I knew that the darkness in my apartment was just darkness, and not a space being occupied by an audience of one. I'm Claire, and I'm 38. My life, by all outward measures, is comfortable, established, and organized. We live in a nice suburb outside Seattle, the kind with tree-lined streets and excellent schools. I'm an accountant, which should tell you everything you need to know about my relationship with order and detail. My husband David is a programmer. He's logical, practical, and blessedly immune to the little anxieties that govern my life. We have one beautiful, rambunctious 3-year-old son, Leo, who is the light of our existence. The only thing missing from this picture was reliable childcare for those few hours after David and I finished our long workdays. That's where Maya came in. She was 20, a nursing student at the local community college, and she seemed like a gift sent from the universe. She was polite, quiet, and possessed a calm, almost serene energy that Leo immediately responded to. He would melt into her embrace the moment she walked through the door. We hired her 3 nights a week for about a month, and I instantly felt the stress lift. She was a professional, a gentle soul, and I trusted her completely. I have to emphasize my nature. I am meticulous, almost obsessively so. Everything in our house, from the spice rack to the filing cabinets, has a specific, inviolable place. I thrive on order, and my environment is a reflection of my inner control. It wasn't until the 3rd week of Maya's employment that the feeling of wrongness started. It didn't begin with anything large or expensive. It started with tiny, minute details that only someone with my level of meticulousness would ever, in a million years, notice. It wasn't theft. It was surveillance. The first incident was so trivial I almost dismissed it as a momentary lapse of memory. I found a loose paperclip on the corner of my mahogany dresser, right next to my jewelry box. Now, my office is downstairs. I use paperclips for filing invoices, never in the bedroom. I immediately went through a mental checklist. Did Leo sneak one up? No. He's never allowed near the office supplies. Did David bring one up? Impossible. He uses digital note-taking. I picked it up, feeling a prickle of static electricity, a feeling of something being out of place, and tossed it into the nearest junk drawer. 2 days later, the feeling came back, stronger this time. I was brushing my teeth, and I noticed my electric toothbrush charger. It was moved precisely 3 inches to the right of its usual spot on the bathroom counter. I keep it perfectly aligned with the edge of the granite. 3 inches. It seemed insane to even notice it, much less dwell on it, but I knew with absolute certainty that I hadn't moved it. David always leaves his charger and toothbrush exactly where they are. Maya was the only other person in the house. I tried to suppress the rising anxiety. She was watching my son, not rummaging through my life. Maybe she cleaned the counter and just set it down crookedly. That's what I told myself. But the paperclip and the charger were the beginning of a subtle shift in the physics of my home. My ordered world was being micro-disturbed, and I was the only one who could detect the tremors. The disturbances continued, tiny, insignificant, yet deeply unsettling. A book on the shelf in the living room was pushed in too far. The remote control for the TV was angled slightly toward the kitchen, not straight toward the screen. Each one of these events was a whisper of intrusion, suggesting that while I was out, someone was not simply sitting on my couch watching TV, but was moving through my space, touching and examining the components of my ordered life. I finally told David about it one evening while we were loading the dishwasher. "I think Maya is snooping," I said, trying to keep my voice light, casual. He stopped, looked at the perfectly arranged plates, and laughed. "Snooping? Claire, she's a nursing student. She's focused on Leo, and then she studies. You're stressed about that audit, honey. She probably nudged the charger when she was washing her hands." His practicality made me feel childish, but it didn't quell the rising cold conviction. I wasn't stressed. I was being observed. I knew I hadn't moved those things, and I knew that Maya was the only variable. I had to prove I wasn't crazy, not just to David, but to myself. I needed concrete evidence, something undeniable that David, the programmer of logic, couldn't laugh off as stress. I decided to set a trap, the kind of subtle, almost invisible test only a deeply paranoid accountant would think of. In the kitchen, I keep a stack of petty cash under a ceramic plate in the highest cupboard, well out of Leo's reach. It's maybe $25, just singles and fives for the takeout delivery guy. Before Maya arrived on Friday afternoon, I went to the cupboard. I lifted the plate and carefully arranged the bills in a specific order. A worn $5 bill on the bottom, followed by 3 crisp new $1 bills, and a 20 on top. This was the key. I noted the precise orientation of the wrinkled corners on the singles. The tiny diagonal crease on the corner of the top single was facing due northeast. The middle one was perfectly straight. The bottom one had a tiny tear on the west side. I even took a quick photo with my phone, zoomed in, just to be sure I wasn't hallucinating the details. I was meticulous. I put the plate back down and closed the cupboard, ensuring the cabinet handle clicked perfectly into place. That night, David and I had dinner out. I couldn't focus on the conversation, running through scenarios in my head. Would she steal the money? If she did, it would be an immediate, clean-cut termination. But my gut told me she wouldn't steal. My gut told me she was looking for something else entirely. When we got home around 11:30 p.m., the house was silent. Maya was gone, having left a neat note about Leo's perfect evening and the time she left. David went straight to the garage to check the security system. I went straight to the kitchen cupboard. I lifted the plate. The 20 was still on top, the 5 was still on the bottom. The total amount of cash was unchanged. It was all there. I felt a surge of relief, followed by a cold, sickening realization as I looked closer. The 3 singles in the middle, they were reversed. They hadn't been removed from the stack. The corner creases I had memorized were now facing due southwest. They had been picked up, flipped over, and put back down in the exact middle of the stack. She hadn't taken anything of material value. She had simply confirmed that I had money there, and she had touched it. It was a methodical investigation, a brief, silent inventory of a small, secret part of my life. She was looking, not for cash or jewelry. She was looking for information. She was studying my habits, my secret hiding places, and my predictable responses. The realization that she wasn't a thief but a surveyor was far more terrifying. A thief wants my property. This girl wanted my secrets. I dismissed Maya's services for the following evening, feigning a sudden illness. I needed time, cold, logical time, to analyze the depth of the intrusion. I started checking every private document I had. My financial files were secured behind a lock on my computer, but the physical copies were untouched. Nothing expensive was gone from the house. Maya wasn't after money. She was after the raw data of my life. I went straight to my bedroom and the back of my wardrobe, where I keep my most private, vulnerable items. This is where I stored 2 old, leather-bound journals from my college years, the ones filled with embarrassing youthful anxieties and private feelings. I kept them locked inside a plain wooden box, which I then hid under a pile of scarves. I pulled out the scarves. The wooden box was there, untouched. The small brass lock was secured. Everything looked perfect, just as I had left it. I felt a fleeting sense of relief. But as I reached for the box, I paused. I always kept the box with the lock side facing out, flush against the back wall of the wardrobe. It made it easy to pull out and open. Today, the box was rotated 180 degrees. The lock side was facing inward. The key to the lock was hidden in a hollowed-out ceramic figurine on my nightstand. It was too risky and too time-consuming to unlock the box in the middle of a short babysitting gig. Maya hadn't opened the lock. It was still perfect, still fastened. But she had clearly pulled the box out, examined it, and rotated it before placing it back. She was testing the security, evaluating the importance of the contents based on the presence of the lock. It was forensic snooping. She was mapping the defenses of my emotional perimeter. I sat on the floor, the heavy wooden box in my lap, suddenly feeling naked and completely exposed. This wasn't a random incident. It was a methodical, intellectual assault on my privacy. She was looking for the weak points in my defenses. The paperclip, the charger, the reverse dollar bills, the rotated box. Each incident had been a small, contained shock. The final discovery was a visceral blow that left me reeling. It wasn't about order. It was about trauma. I opened the wooden box. The journals were there. I didn't touch them. I went to the second, smaller compartment inside the box, where I kept things of purely sentimental, non-monetary value. Tucked inside a velvet pouch was a tiny sterling silver locket. The locket contained a single, small curl of my daughter, Clara's hair. Clara died 5 years ago, shortly after her 2nd birthday. It is the most sacred, painful, and carefully guarded memory I possess. The hair was delicate, fragile, and I kept the locket sealed, only opening it maybe once a year on her birthday. I had opened that locket a week prior to check on the curl, just because I sometimes did. It was completely secure inside the tiny plastic insert. Now, I opened the locket again. The small curl of hair was still there, but a thin, auburn strand, no bigger than a thread, had been pulled out of the plastic seal. It was loose, lying curled up in the velvet bottom of the wooden box. I know, logically, that hair can fall out. But this hair was locked down, sealed, 5 years old, and now it was out. It felt like a violation of the dead. Maya had been in the wardrobe. She had rotated the box, and she had opened the locket, touched the hair, and somehow, a single strand had been liberated from its safe haven. She hadn't stolen the locket. She had taken something far more valuable, a piece of my personal grief, a sliver of my deepest trauma. She had peered into the wound. I sat there, breathing heavily, clutching the velvet pouch. David's voice telling me I was paranoid faded completely. This was not a misplaced charger. This was methodical, perverse curiosity. She wasn't seeking validation for herself. She was collecting data on my most painful vulnerabilities for a twisted, private satisfaction. I immediately called her and told her I needed her to come in on Monday, 2 days earlier than planned, to discuss a schedule change. I wanted to end it face to face. I needed to see her eyes, to look at the person who had so silently and clinically invaded the very core of my life. Monday evening, Maya arrived, looking as calm and gentle as ever. Leo went straight to her, giggling. I took her into the kitchen, away from David and Leo. I didn't mention the money, the locket, or the hair. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of knowing I had figured out her game. I kept my voice measured and professional. Maya, you're absolutely amazing with Leo, and we value you, I began, folding my hands on the counter, mimicking her calm posture. But I need to ask you not to come back. We won't be needing your services anymore. Her expression didn't change. She didn't look confused, hurt, or guilty. There was only a cold, quiet resignation in her eyes, as if she knew this conversation was inevitable, that she had pushed the boundary too far, and the subject had become aware of the experiment. "Why?" she asked, her voice low and even. No denial, no outrage. Just an inquiry into the termination of her access. "I think," I said, meeting her eyes directly, "that you've been going through my personal things. I think you've been looking." For the first time, her composure cracked slightly, not with fear, but with an almost academic dismissal. "I didn't take anything," she murmured, avoiding my gaze and looking toward the cabinet where I kept the dollar bills. "I know," I said. "That's why I'm asking you to leave." That quiet confirmation of my awareness was the final act of the confrontation. She didn't ask for severance or an explanation. She simply picked up her backpack, gave Leo a quick, strangely possessive hug, and walked out the door. She didn't look back. The true horror wasn't the material theft. It was the feeling that for 3 weeks, I had invited a cold, calculating stranger into my home who had methodically examined my deepest vulnerabilities, piece by piece, not for profit, but for a twisted, private satisfaction. It made me feel exposed and sick, like someone had secretly read every embarrassing thought I'd ever had. The locks, the safes, the passwords, they were all meaningless. The greatest threat was not external, but the silent, clinical curiosity of a mind inside my walls, mapping the coordinates of my trauma. The most insidious forms of violation are often not acts of material theft, but acts of surveillance and intrusion upon personal privacy. The fear is not what a person takes, but what they deliberately choose to know about you, creating a twisted sense of intimacy and power that leaves you feeling exposed long after they are gone. I was 19, home for the summer after my chaotic first year of college, and my bank account was screaming for mercy. That's how I ended up answering a Craigslist ad for a part-time sitter for the Caldwells. They lived in a neighborhood full of those massive, older homes that had been sliced up and reconfigured over the decades, resulting in architectural Frankensteins. The Caldwells themselves were aggressively normal, a couple who offered me lemonade and talked about their cross-country skiing trip. Their son, Caleb, was 5, sweet, and maybe a little too quiet, but their house? It felt functionally wrong. It was a labyrinth of useless doors. The kitchen had a small, unmarked wooden door leading to a tiny linen closet, which then unexpectedly opened into the main hall. It felt less like a home and more like a poorly edited blueprint. Mrs. Caldwell gave me one non-negotiable rule before they left. Do not, under any circumstances, go into the small blue room off the laundry area. It's just storage, and the door sticks badly. The instruction felt oddly weighted, like a warning wrapped in an excuse. I agreed, took their number, and waved them off. Standard mac and cheese and cartoons followed. When I was tucking Caleb in around 8:30 p.m., I looked around his room and noticed the impossible layout. He had 3 doors, the main hall door, the bathroom door, and a third door that was almost completely covered by a tall, bolted-down bookcase. "Where does that door go?" I asked Caleb, pointing at the wood half hidden by the bookshelf. Caleb's eyes widened instantly, darting away from the door. He clutched his worn stuffed dinosaur. "Nowhere," he whispered, a tiny tremor in his voice. "Daddy nailed that one shut a long time ago." The image of Mr. Caldwell deliberately nailing a door shut in his son's bedroom stuck with me. Why not just remove the knob? Why not use that room for storage? Around 10 p.m., with Caleb asleep, I went downstairs to finish the laundry. The small laundry room was stiflingly hot, and the ancient washing machine was grinding loudly. Standing there, I realized the small blue room was right beside me. Its door was painted a pale, robin's egg blue, and looked completely innocuous. Storage. The door sticks, I reminded myself. But my curiosity had fully conquered my reason. I tried the handle. It didn't stick at all. It was locked with a modern, sturdy deadbolt. I felt a cold prickle of fear. Valuables don't require that kind of security inside a family home. I pulled out my phone and shone the flashlight beam under the door. A sliver of darkness, maybe an inch of clearance, separated the bottom of the door from the carpet. I could see nothing. I went back to the living room, but the silence, once the washer stopped, felt heavy and wrong. The quiet didn't last. About 20 minutes later, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound coming from deep inside the house, past the kitchen, and definitely from the direction of the laundry room. Tap, pause, tap, pause. It was too steady to be the pipes settling. It sounded like a finger or a small piece of metal hitting a hard surface. It was deliberate. I crept back toward the laundry area, my body tense and cold despite the room's heat. The tapping grew clearer as I approached the blue door. I pressed my ear against the deadbolt. The sound stopped immediately. It was as if whatever was on the other side knew I was listening. "Hello?" I whispered into the wood. My voice sounded thin and foolish. Silence. I waited, holding my breath until my lungs burned. Then, a new sound emerged from the other side of the door. It was a small, dry hiss. It wasn't a snake. It sounded exactly like someone trying to whisper with a mouthful of sawdust. Or maybe just the sound of labored, difficult breathing. A chilling, impossible sound. I scrambled back, away from the door, running toward the front hall, my mind racing. I grabbed my keys and phone from the entry table. I was going to call the Caldwells, invent an emergency, and flee. I was halfway to the front door when I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. It was faint, but unmistakable. But this time, it was not coming from the laundry room. It was coming from upstairs. Specifically, it was coming from Caleb's room. I stood paralyzed at the foot of the dark stairwell. There was no exterior window on that side of the house for someone to be tapping on. The only hard metal surface I could think of up there, other than the bed frame, was the handle of the third, bolted door behind the bookcase, the door that Caleb said his father had nailed shut. My mind raced through the house's impossible geometry, fitting the pieces together in a horrific spatial realization. I had been sitting in this house for hours. I knew the layout, and I knew the most terrifying detail. The blue room off the laundry area, the one with the deadbolt, was not directly underneath Caleb's room. The Caldwell's house was a two-story structure. And based on the window placement and the outside topography, the blue room was clearly a second, small bedroom on the ground floor, situated deep within the house. It was parallel to the kitchen, nowhere near the space below Caleb's room. I suddenly understood. The tapping the person in the blue room on the ground floor had stopped when I pressed my ear against the door. Then, moments later, the tapping had resumed, but on the second floor, in Caleb's room. This wasn't an intruder. This was a resident whom the Caldwells were hiding, perhaps confining, in that dead-bolted room. They told me it was storage to keep me away. The shifting sound proved that whoever was inside wasn't trapped. They were merely let out. They had used the confusing, maze-like architecture of the house, all those inexplicable doors, all those hidden passages to move from the ground floor to the second floor without me hearing a single footstep on the main stairs. The nailed door in Caleb's room wasn't bolted shut to keep people out. It was the secret entry point for the person who had just transitioned quietly from the blue room to the second floor. The tapping I heard from upstairs was a signal, either a new form of communication or perhaps a warning directed at me. I didn't check on Caleb. I didn't dare go upstairs to verify the sounds. I just ran. I sprinted out the front door, slamming it behind me, and didn't stop until I was 2 blocks away in my beat-up car. I called the police from a gas station. They found nothing out of the ordinary, just an empty, locked house. The Caldwells never returned home or paid the remaining mortgage. That night, I realized the scariest part of that house wasn't the confusing layout, but the fact that I had nearly become the final, missing piece of the puzzle, forever hidden within its impossible walls. When you feel an acute, persistent sense of wrongness about a person or a place, trust that instinct immediately. The things people are most determined to hide are often concealed not with locks, but with plausible excuses and distracting complexities. Your mind is a better alarm system than any deadbolt. I was 21, a junior in college, and I'd been sitting for the Dyers for almost a year. They were the perfect family gig, a sweet, middle-class couple, totally normal, with 2 kids, 10-year-old Chloe and 7-year-old Finn. I thought I knew their routines down to the minute. My name is Jess, and the only thing that ever raised an eyebrow was their absolutely rigid bedtime ritual. The Dyers were obsessed with the clock. Their kids had to be asleep by 9 p.m. on the dot. No negotiation, no exceptions, and certainly no bargaining. They even maintained a meticulous binder listing the precise steps: teeth brushed by 8:40 p.m., lights out by 8:50 p.m. The final, strange rule was for me, the sitter. I had to be completely silent and seated on the living room sofa by 9 p.m. I'd seen Mr. Dyer physically tense up if the clock nudged 8:55 p.m. and the kids weren't in bed yet. One particular Tuesday, the parents were late leaving, held up by a phone call. Mr. Dyer practically bolted out the front door, checking his watch every 5 seconds. 9 o'clock, Jess, he hissed at me, his voice strangely tight. Do not miss the deadline. It is absolutely crucial. I chalked it up to intense parenting, a hyper-strict routine for restless kids, but the level of anxiety he displayed was off-putting. It felt less like a schedule and more like a deadline for disaster. That night, everything was chaos. Chloe had a massive meltdown over a chipped doll. Finn spilled an entire glass of grape juice in the hall, and I was running late on cleanup. I was completely flustered, fighting the clock and the sticky floor. I finally managed to tuck Finn in and give him a rushed kiss goodnight at 8:58 p.m. He was already half asleep. I raced across the hall to Chloe's room. She was wide awake, lying stiffly on her back, staring at the ceiling. The light was still on. Close the door all the way, she commanded, her voice surprisingly flat and emotionless for a girl who had been crying 10 minutes earlier. And don't talk to me after the clock hits 9. She didn't look at me, her eyes fixed above. I didn't have a second to argue or ask why. I flipped the light switch at 8:59 p.m., plunging her room into darkness, and sprinted down the stairs. I collapsed onto the sofa cushion just as my phone screen clicked from 8:59 to 9 p.m. I felt a physical wave of relief wash over me. I had hit the deadline. The house went completely silent. And I mean silent. It wasn't the usual, kids are asleep quiet that follows a noisy house. It was a deep, unnerving dead silence, a stillness that felt like the air had been entirely sucked out of every room. The central air stopped humming. The refrigerator seemed to cease its low thrum. I sat there, trying to convince myself it was just the house settling, but it felt oppressive, heavy. I pulled out my phone and started scrolling, trying to distract myself from the heavy atmosphere. The silence was so profound that my own breathing seemed too loud. After about 10 minutes of scrolling, I realized I could hear a new sound coming from the kitchen. It was faint, rhythmic, and incredibly unsettling. It was low and wet, a soft slish-slish that shouldn't be happening in a locked, quiet house where everyone was supposed to be asleep. My heart started thumping against my ribs. I slowly pushed myself off the sofa, walking quietly toward the archway leading to the kitchen. Every sense was on high alert. I crept to the archway and peeked around the frame. The kitchen was dark, lit only by the faint, diffused orange glow of the streetlight filtering through the window above the sink, and standing right at the center island, perfectly still, was Chloe, the 10-year-old. She wasn't sleepwalking. She was standing upright, facing the counter and the knife block, her back entirely toward me. She wasn't making a snack or getting water. She was making that wet sound. It was the low, rhythmic clicking of her own tongue against the inside of her teeth, almost like a dry sucking sound, except for the moisture in her mouth. It sounded utterly vacant and focused at the same time. I froze, barely breathing, terrified to move. Her stillness was unnatural. It was a hunter's stillness. The rhythm of the tongue clicking was hypnotic and deeply disturbing. The low, wet, rhythmic sound continued for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only a minute or two. I watched Chloe's silhouette, not daring to call out, convinced that doing so would trigger something terrible. She was utterly locked into whatever trance or state she was in. Then, the clicking sound stopped. Chloe slowly, deliberately, raised her right hand. Her arm was completely straight, moving with unnerving mechanical precision. She reached out toward the large wooden knife block situated right in front of her. Her fingers, small and pale in the faint light, stretched toward the handle of the largest chef's knife, the 8-inch blade the parents used for cutting roasts. Just as her fingertips brushed the cold metal handle, a different sound sliced through the oppressive silence. The loud, sharp click of a deadbolt turning, followed by the sound of the front door being opened. It was 9:15 p.m. The Dyers were home half an hour early. The sound of the door and the voices in the hall seemed to break the spell. Chloe's entire body seemed to deflate, going from rigid tension to normal limpness in an instant. She dropped her hand from the knife and, without looking back, walked out of the kitchen and up the stairs to her room with a completely normal, tired gait. She looked like any ordinary 10-year-old who had just woken up for a trip to the bathroom. She never looked at me. Mr. and Mrs. Dyer walked into the house, looking strangely pale and tense, immediately scanning the silent living room. They didn't even notice their daughter heading back upstairs. "Everything okay, Jess?" Mr. Dyer asked, his voice low and strained. "Yeah, fine. Just a late night," I mumbled, still staring at the glossy, dark surface of the knife block, imagining Chloe's fingers on it. Mrs. Dyer came over to pay me. She counted the cash into my hand, her fingers brushing mine. She didn't mention being home early. Instead, she leaned in slightly and gave me an odd, knowing look that sent chills down my spine. "Thank you, Jess," she said softly. "Thank you for getting them down on time. It's important that they're still for the first few minutes after 9. The way she emphasized "on time" and "still" made it clear that those 15 minutes were the entire point of the ritual. I realized then that the extreme 9 o'clock deadline wasn't about a sleep schedule. It was a time-sensitive quarantine. The 15 minutes of rigid silence was a window of vulnerability when something, some impulse, some dark instinct was active within their children, specifically Chloe. The parents' job wasn't to tuck them in. It was to keep the house silent and abandoned during the window. And their early return at 9:15 p.m. was their protection, the counterforce that broke the cycle. I took the money and left immediately. I never went back to the Dyers. I still don't know what was happening during that 15-minute window. Was the ritual meant to keep something out? Or was it a desperate, nightly attempt to keep something in, some dangerous, surfacing impulse in their child that they knew only surfaces when the house is quiet and the clock strikes 9? I only know that I don't want to be the witness when the window is missed. Be wary of routines and rules that lack rational explanation, especially when they are enforced with disproportionate fear and intensity. In domestic settings, extreme rigidity often masks a secret, desperate attempt to control an internal threat, and the witness to that routine is often the only one who sees the true, chilling nature of the control. The year I turned 20 was marked by a series of desperate, last-minute decisions. The most memorable being the night I took a strange babysitting job for a family named White. They lived way outside the suburbs, in a beautifully renovated farmhouse that backed up to thick woods. It was the kind of place that looked serene in the daylight but felt suffocatingly isolated once the sun went down. My job was to watch their 7-year-old daughter, Clara, a girl who was unnervingly sweet and quiet. The parents were rushing out to a late work dinner, barely giving me time to get the rundown. As Mrs. White was halfway out the door, she paused, pulling me close for one very specific, whispered instruction. "Clara is sensitive to sound," she stressed, her eyes wide. "The house must be completely silent after 9 p.m. No music, no TV, not even quiet talking. If you use your phone, put it on silent, and wear earbuds." I thought the rule was bizarre. Who demands absolute, total silence? But the money was good, and I needed it. I agreed, dismissing it as helicopter parenting gone extreme. That night, I discovered it was something far, far worse. Clara was an easy kid. She drew me a picture of a smiling sun, brushed her teeth without prompting, and was tucked into her bed at the end of the long, dark hallway upstairs by 8:45 p.m. Her room was clean, sparse, and faced the woods, which only added to the isolation. Once she was settled, I retreated to the living room downstairs. At exactly 9 p.m., I put in my noise-canceling earbuds, opened my laptop, and started watching a movie trailer on mute, figuring I'd kill time researching for college applications. The house immediately settled into a profound, almost aggressive silence. It wasn't the natural quiet of a sleeping house. It was a deep, heavy absence of noise that felt like a blanket had been thrown over my head. I could practically hear the pressure change in my eardrums. About 15 minutes into my research, I decided I needed a glass of water. I paused the video, pulled out my earbuds, and stood up from the couch. The total silence hit me again, and that's when I noticed the anomaly. I started walking toward the kitchen, and as my right sneaker lifted off the hardwood floor, I distinctly heard the faint creak of it settling back down. Seconds before my foot actually landed, I froze, heart slamming against my ribs. I tried again. I took a deliberate, measured step with my left foot. Before the leather sole even made contact with the wood, I heard the soft, dull thud of the impact. It wasn't an echo. It was a clean, audible reversal of time, a sound that predicted my movement. My reality felt suddenly, chillingly broken. Adrenaline flooded my system, overriding panic with a cold need to understand. I moved slowly, testing the phenomenon like a cruel physics experiment. I walked to the kitchen and grabbed a glass from the cupboard. The loud clink of the glass touching the counter sounded a fraction of a second before my fingers released it. The most terrifying moment came when I walked to the bottom of the staircase. I focused on the 6th step, the one I had already identified earlier that evening because it had a familiar, loud squeak. I slowly raised my foot to touch the step, preparing myself. Before my shoe was even hovering an inch above the wood, I heard the full, familiar, loud, unmistakable squeak. It wasn't just predicting a common sound, it was predicting a specific, known event. My terror shifted from a fear of ghosts to a paralyzing fear of sensory failure and a broken reality. I had to check on Clara. I crept up the stairs, moving awkwardly because I was constantly anticipating the sounds of my own movement that had, for all intents and purposes, already happened in the audible sense. The silence up here was even more oppressive, sucking the air and light from the hallway. When I finally reached the top, I stopped, straining to hear any normal, innocent sound from Clara's room. Then, I heard it, a small, dry, childlike giggle coming from the end of the hall, near Clara's door. It wasn't loud, but in that profound silence, it was as sharp and clear as a gunshot. It shouldn't have been there. Clara was supposed to be asleep. I stood motionless, my eyes glued to the dark, open doorway of Clara's room. My phone was still clutched in my hand, the flashlight off, useless against the strange physics of the house. The giggle came again. Fainter this time, like a secret shared just beyond the door. It was immediately followed by a soft, rhythmic sound. The distinct, low creak, stop of a child rocking back and forth in a chair. It was innocent enough on its own, but combined with the sound reversal, it felt predatory. I stood there for what felt like an hour, watching the black space of the doorway, waiting for something to be illuminated, for the girl in the rocking chair to appear. The rhythmic rocking sound was continuous, a metronome counting down to an unknown event. But the giggles only happened intermittently, small puffs of malice in the dark. My legs were shaking by the time I finally forced myself to move. I took 2 silent steps down the hallway toward the room. I was calculating the auditory delay in my head, knowing that by the time I heard my footsteps, I would already be further along. Then, the rocking stopped. The silence snapped back in, with violent force. Suddenly, an absolutely massive, crashing thud erupted from within Clara's room. The sound of heavy furniture, maybe a dresser or, I thought, the rocking chair, flipping over and shattering into pieces. The noise was instantly followed by a loud, desperate, piercing scream. It was the sound of a child in absolute, immediate distress. My survival instinct kicked in, shattering my paralysis. I broke into a full run, slamming the bedroom door open, the flashlight on my phone blinding me for a second. The room was perfectly intact. Clara was in her bed, sitting bolt upright, eyes wide, breathing heavily, but otherwise untouched. Her stuffed animals were on the shelf. The furniture was solid, and there was absolutely no rocking chair, not even a small one. Nothing was broken, displaced, or shattered. The room was silent. The only sound was Clara's ragged, terrified breathing and the pounding in my ears. I kept the flashlight trained on the empty floor, searching for the source of the crashing sound, but there was nothing. It had been as loud and physical as a car accident, yet the room was pristine. I slowly backed out, pulling the door almost shut behind me. I looked back down the long, dark hallway, where the massive thud and the scream had erupted just seconds before. I now heard a soft, clear, chilling, childlike whisper. It came before I could possibly see any movement or action. A sound delivered to my present from the future. They say the silence is so deep here, it pulls the sound out of the future. I turned back to the terrified girl in the bed. Her lips hadn't moved. Her eyes were still locked on the doorway, staring past me. The scream I had heard seconds ago was her scream of pure terror. The whisper I had just heard was her voice, calmly explaining the mechanism of her house's horror. The house was not silent. It was time-bending, allowing auditory events to occur before their physical cause. I didn't need any more evidence. My mind replayed the entire evening, the creak of my shoe landing before it landed, the squeak of the step before I touched it, and now, the shattering chair and scream before I entered the room. The house wasn't just sensitive to sound. It was manipulating time itself, capturing future noises and dumping them into the present moment. I rushed back downstairs, grabbing my jacket and laptop from the couch. As I moved toward the front door, the final, horrifying realization dawned on me. The parents' rule wasn't for Clara's sensitivity. It was to keep her quiet. The profound, total silence was their means of containing or preventing the house's disturbing effect from manifesting and ruining their night out. They wanted silence, so they wouldn't have to hear the sound of the future. As I fumbled with the locks, I heard the future sounds of the parents' car pulling up in the driveway, the crunch of the tires on the gravel, the slam of the car door a good hour before it actually happened. I bolted. I left the laptop, the keys, everything, fumbling out onto the gravel driveway and running toward the main road without looking back at the dark farmhouse. I didn't care about the job, the money, or facing the whites. I just needed to escape the place where every sound was a lie and every action was already foretold. I walked for 2 miles, shivering and listening to the real, normal sounds of the wind in the woods until my phone got service and I could call a cab. I never contacted the whites, and I never saw Clara again. But sometimes, when I'm alone in a quiet room, I hear a faint, distant sound that I can't place, and I freeze, terrified that my future has just caught up to me. The gig was supposed to be easy money. I was house-sitting for a family, the Millers, who owned a colossal, isolated lakefront property about an hour north of the city. They were a seemingly normal family with 2 quiet, college-age teenagers. My only real responsibilities for the week were to feed their grumpy Persian cat and make sure the place didn't spontaneously combust. Easy enough. The house itself was the primary reason I took the job. It was stunning, a modern, slightly uneven U-shape, built with immense windows that gave every room a breathtaking view of a secluded cove on the lake. The main living room was a spectacle, a massive, open-concept rectangle dominated by an entire wall of floor-to-ceiling glass. I had been there 4 nights, and the peace was total. It was the kind of safe, silent isolation I usually craved, but that feeling of sanctuary was about to be obliterated by a simple, impossible reflection. It was the 5th night. I had settled into the enormous, plush, sectional couch around 11:30 p.m. The Millers had a ridiculous amount of cable, so I was watching a forgettable action movie and nursing a mug of tea. The main lights were off, leaving the room bathed in the soft, flickering glow of the screen and the warm, low light from a floor lamp near the kitchen door. The atmosphere was cozy, domestic, and utterly normal. I knew the living room layout like the back of my hand. Facing the lake were 3 massive glass panels, the windows. To the right was the massive stone fireplace, taking up the whole wall space, and behind the couch was a solid, interior wall leading to the hallway. I got up to put my empty mug in the sink, taking the route that led me directly past the lake-facing windows. As I walked, I glanced out at the black expanse of the lake, catching my own ghostly reflection in the glass. It was a clear image, my face, the couch, the fireplace on the right. Then I saw it. The reflection didn't stop at the fireplace. Behind the couch, reflecting in the glass of the main windows exactly where the solid, rough stone wall of the fireplace should have been, was a 4th window. My feet stopped dead on the polished concrete floor. The 4th window in the reflection was the exact same size and shape as the 3 I was looking through. If I was seeing a reflection of a 4th window in the glass of the others, it meant that behind the couch, there was light coming from the outside, showing the interior of a room. Yet, the area behind the couch was the solid stone of the fireplace wall. My stomach dropped, replaced by a cold, searing shock. This wasn't a trick of the light or a double pane. I turned slowly, my heart trying to hammer its way out of my chest. The stone fireplace was right there. I walked up to it, running my hand over the cold, rough face of the granite. It was solid, unmoving. No hidden door, no window, no light source whatsoever. I spun back to face the lake view glass. The reflection of the fourth window was still visible. The night outside was black, but the reflected room was subtly illuminated, showing the faint, warm orange glow of a table lamp, the same floor lamp I had turned off moments ago. I started testing the geometry, desperately searching for a rational explanation. I moved 3 feet to the left, then 3 feet to the right. The reflection moved with me, remaining perfectly aligned in the glass, still showing a fourth window directly behind the couch, parallel to the fireplace. That's when the horrifying realization hit me. The reflection wasn't showing the space behind the couch in the room I was currently in. The reflection was showing the exact dimensions and contents of this room, but from a different, unseen structure, located directly behind the Miller house. The reflection I was seeing was the outside of a second, identical house. I looked out at the dark lake, which was acting as a perfect, massive mirror. The reflection suggested that the entire Miller house was being perfectly mirrored by a second, identical structure, a copy built precisely parallel to it, separated by maybe 10 or 15 yards of empty space. Who builds a perfect, window-for-window copy of a luxury home, hidden in the trees behind the original, and why? Was it some elaborate, abandoned guest house, a storage facility? The thought of a parallel structure that perfectly replicated the architecture of the house I was in, down to the positioning of the windows, was profoundly unsettling. The sheer cost, the isolation, and the stealth of it made no sense. It had to be deliberate. As I stared, transfixed, the impossible fourth window in the reflection held my gaze. It showed the identical room, illuminated by an identical lamp, but completely empty. Then, I saw movement. In the reflection of the fourth window, the one that should have been the stone fireplace, I saw a shadow pass. It was a tall, thin shape, moving slowly from the right side of the window to the left. The movement was deliberate, like a person walking slowly past the glass. It paused directly in the middle. It was watching the original house. It was watching me. The sight of that slow-moving shadow was the final catalyst. Rationality vanished, replaced by an urgent, primal need to see the truth. I didn't grab a weapon. I grabbed my keys and the heavy-duty flashlight the Millers kept by the back door. I unlocked the deadbolt and bolted out onto the deck. The cat, roused by my sudden movements, gave me a single, disgusted yowl. I ignored him and ran off the deck, plunging into the darkness of the backyard. I circled the perimeter of the house, shining the powerful beam into the dense woods directly behind the structure. My mind was screaming, "A guest house. It has to be a large shed or a guest house." I ran until I was out of breath, navigating mud and thick undergrowth. I swung the beam back and forth, cutting through the darkness. The beam hit only trees, mud, and dense foliage. No other building, no guest house, no shed, no concrete foundation, no telltale reflection of light on glass. Nothing but the woods, going back indefinitely. I checked my watch. I had been out there for close to 6 minutes, frantically running and searching. The trees were too dense, the land too overgrown, to hide a structure the size of the Miller house. It simply wasn't there. Exhausted, shaking, and completely bewildered, I stumbled back inside. I slammed the back door shut and locked it, checking the deadbolt twice. My knees buckled slightly, and I leaned against the kitchen counter, trying to catch my breath and regulate my panicked thoughts. Why did I see it? Was I hallucinating from the isolation? But the consistency of the reflection, the exact parallel structure, the movement of the shadow, it had been too perfect, too physically precise, to be a mere trick of the eye. I slowly walked back into the living room, approaching the 3 massive lake-facing windows. I took a deep breath, braced myself, and looked at the reflection in the glass. It was back to normal. The reflection showed 3 windows, the couch, and the solid stone fireplace where the fourth window had been. Behind the reflected image of the house was only the black void of the woods. The identical, mirrored house, the house with the watching shadow, was gone. I sat in the kitchen, a brightly lit, sterile room, until the first hint of morning light crept over the lake. I fed the cat, who seemed smugly satisfied with my terror. I never told the Millers a word, but I knew that night that I had stumbled upon the terrifying, hidden truth of their isolation. They weren't just living in a lake house. They were living in a reality that was being perfectly and precisely observed by an identical structure that only appeared when it chose to be seen. The house wasn't isolated. It was duplicated, and someone, or something, was waiting inside the copy. Be wary of environments that offer you perfect, undisturbed solitude. In true isolation, The only thing that can observe you is either yourself or something that is not meant to be there, capable of mirroring your reality in a way that confirms your deepest fears.